death of a 24-year-old boy lead to the annihilation of a grand duchy and drive his successor into the arms of the Nazis? History often records the collapse of empires through wars and treaties, but the truth is that the end often begins with a hidden family tragedy. When Prince Alfred pulled the trigger on the night of his parents' wedding anniversary, he didn't just kill himself. He unwittingly triggered a bloody domino effect that transformed a prestigious royal dynasty into a family of exiles and war criminals. Welcome to the fall of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But before the fall, there was a golden beginning, or so it seemed. Alfred Alexander William Ernest Albert was born on October 15, 1874, at Buckingham Palace. He was the first son of Queen Victoria's second son, Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, and his new wife, the Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia. On paper, this was the ultimate royal merger. It was the union of the world's greatest maritime power, Britain, and the world's greatest land empire, Russia. It should have produced a dynasty of unparalleled strength. Instead, it produced a domestic war zone. Afy's mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was the only surviving daughter of Tsar Alexander II. She had grown up in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, surrounded by a level of wealth and autocracy that made the British royal family look like middle-class shopkeepers. She was intelligent, cultured, and breathtakingly arrogant. When she arrived in London in 1874, she looked around at the drafty palaces, the gloomy weather, and the constitutional monarchy where the Queen had to answer to Parliament, and she sneered. To her, England was small, it was vulgar, and worst of all, it didn't respect her rank. The central conflict of Afy's childhood was the war of precedence between his mother and the Princess of Wales, Alexandra. Alexandra was Danish, from a minor, impoverished royal house. Maria was a Romanov, an imperial highness. By every rule of the Russian court, Maria should have outranked Alexandra. But in England, the wife of the heir to the throne came first. Queen Victoria refused to change the rules. Maria refused to accept them. She would deliberately arrive late to events so she could make a grand entrance. She would refuse to stand when the Princess of Wales entered the room. She wore her magnificent Russian jewels like armor, literally outshining the British royals to prove a point. The atmosphere in Clarence House, the family's London residence, was toxic with resentment. Maria drilled into her children, Afy and his 4 younger sisters, that they were Romanovs first, Coburg's second, and English a distant third. She told them that the British court was dull and unintellectual, that their cousins were badly educated, and that they belonged to a superior breed of royalty. And then there was the father. Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, was Queen Victoria's second son, and in his youth he had been the handsome, dashing one. But by the time Afy was born, Alfred was hardening into a difficult, embittered man. He was a career naval officer, and he loved the sea far more than he loved his wife or children. The Royal Navy was his escape. He would vanish for years at a time to the Mediterranean, to Australia, to the Far East, leaving his Russian wife to stew in her anger in London. When he was home, he was a martinet. He ran his household with the strict discipline of a battleship. He was gruff, emotionally distant, and increasingly dependent on alcohol. He was a functional drunk, the kind who could stand straight at a reception, but whose temper was on a hair trigger, fueled by gin and resentment. He had little patience for the sensitivities of children, especially a son who didn't seem to have the requisite grit. This was the environment that molded young Afy. He was the only son, the precious one. From the moment he drew breath, he was crushed under the weight of expectation. He wasn't just a child, he was an investment. He was the future Duke of Edinburgh. He was a potential future admiral. He was a pawn in the great game of European dynastic politics. But nature had played a cruel trick on the Duke and Duchess. They wanted a warrior. They got a poet. People who knew Afy as a child described a boy of profound, almost painful sensitivity. He was physically delicate, with large, soulful eyes that seemed to take in too much of the world. He inherited his father's musical talent. The one redeeming quality of the elder Alfred was his genuine skill with the violin. But Afy's love for music wasn't a hobby. It was a refuge. He loved to draw, to wander in gardens, to read. He was gentle. In the rough-and-tumble world of Victorian boyhood, where he was expected to box, to shoot, and to ride hard, Afy was an outlier. He was the kind of boy who would save a bird with a broken wing, not shoot it. His sisters adored him. The eldest, Marie, who would later become the famous Queen Marie of Romania, worshipped her big brother. In her memoirs, written decades later, she paints a picture of a golden boy who was their leader, their protector, and their fragile heart. They called him Young Afy to distinguish him from Old Afy, their father. The distinction was telling. Old Afy was fear and absence. Young Afy was warmth and presence. They spent their happiest years in Malta, where the Duke was stationed with the Mediterranean fleet. Under the warm Mediterranean sun, away from the gloom of London and the stifling etiquette of Windsor, Afy flourished. He swam in the blue sea, he rode horses through the dusty hills, he laughed. For a few brief years he was allowed to be just a boy, but the golden cage was closing in. The destiny that would kill him was forged not in London or St. Petersburg, but in a small town in central Germany called Coburg. The Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was the ancestral home of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's late husband. It was the holy land of the family. The reigning duke was Albert's brother, the scandalous and debauched Duke Ernst II. Ernst had no legitimate children. The succession laws were clear. The throne must pass to the next male in the line. That was the Prince of Wales, Bertie. But Bertie was the heir to the British Empire. He could not be a German sovereign and a British king simultaneously. So with a stroke of a pen, Bertie renounced his rights to the duchy. The burden fell to the next brother, Alfred, Afy's father, and by extension it fell to Afy. In 1893, Duke Ernst died. The telegrams flew across Europe. Overnight, the life of the Edinburgh family was uprooted. They were no longer just British royals. They were now German sovereigns. They had to pack up their lives in Clarence House and move to the heart of the German Empire. For Afy's mother, this was a triumph. She was finally a sovereign duchess, out from under the shadow of the Princess of Wales. She loved the pomp, the deference, the autocracy of Germany. For 18-year-old Afy, it was a catastrophe. He was ripped away from everything he knew. He was English. He thought in English. He joked in English. His friends were English. Suddenly, he was the hereditary prince of a German state. He was expected to speak perfect German, which he struggled with. He was expected to wear a German uniform. He was expected to lead German regiments, and he was walking straight into the lion's den. Because Coburg wasn't just a quaint little duchy. It was a satellite of Prussia. And the man who watched over it with eagle eyes and a withered arm was his first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Wilhelm was everything Afy was not. He was loud, aggressive, obsessed with the military, and deeply insecure. He despised the soft English influence in his family. When he looked at his new cousin, the hereditary prince, he didn't see a sensitive young man with artistic potential. He saw a project. He saw a weakling that needed to be hammered into a Prussian soldier. The transition was brutal. Afy was thrown into the 1st Regiment of the Coburg Guards. He was put through the grinder of Prussian military discipline. He had to learn the goose step. He had to learn to shout orders. He had to stand on parade grounds for hours in the freezing rain, inspecting troops, pretending to care about ballistics and logistics. His sister Marie wrote heartbreakingly of this time. She saw the light go out in her brother's eyes. He felt entirely out of place, she said. He was an actor thrust onto a stage, forced to play a role he hated with no intermission and no exit. He tried to adapt, he really did. He bought the uniforms, he grew the mustache, he learned the drills. But inside, the resentment was festering. He was bored, he was lonely. The provincial court of Coburg was stiff and stifling compared to the cosmopolitan life in London or Malta. The local aristocracy judged him for his English accent and his lack of martial ardor. His father, now ruling the duchy, became even more demanding, criticizing Afy's posture, his riding, his lack of manliness. And so, Afy did what trapped young men have done for centuries. He sought escape. If he couldn't be free in the daylight, he would be free in the dark. He began to travel. He convinced his parents to let him go to Berlin, to Vienna, to Paris, supposedly for his education or diplomatic training. In reality, he was diving headfirst into the underworld of the fin de siècle. The 1890s in Europe was a time of schizophrenia. On the surface, it was strict, moral, and upright. Beneath the surface, it was a carnival of vice. Afy, with his pockets full of ducal gold and his title opening every door, found his way into the high-class brothels, the gambling dens, and the private salons of the demi-monde. He found people who didn't care about his marching drills. He found women who whispered that he was handsome, that he was charming. He found wine that dulled the constant nagging voice of his father in his head. He was looking for connection. He was looking for a way to feel something other than the crushing weight of duty. But in the gaslit bedrooms of Vienna or Berlin, amidst the velvet and the perfume, a microscopic assassin was waiting for him. It was a bacteria called Treponema pallidum, syphilis. It started innocuously enough, a sore, a fever, a rash, things that could be explained away or hidden with powder and stubbornness. A doctor might have given him a salve and told him to be more careful. Afy probably thought he had dodged a bullet when the initial symptoms faded. He didn't know that the disease hadn't gone away. It had just gone underground. It was burrowing deep into his system, riding his bloodstream, waiting for the moment to strike at the very center of who he was. By 1896, the clock was ticking. The golden boy was carrying a time bomb in his blood, and back in Coburg, the walls were closing in. The family was talking about marriage. They needed an heir. They needed him to settle down, to become a respectable German duke. They had no idea that their precious heir was already rotting from the inside out. The tragedy was set. The players were in place. The gun was loaded. It was only a matter of time before the trigger was pulled. The bacteria that entered Prince Alfred's bloodstream in the mid-1890s was a great leveler. It did not care about the coat of arms of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It did not care that his grandmother was the Queen Empress of a quarter of the globe, or that his cousin was the supreme warlord of Germany. In the microscopic world, a prince is just meat, just a host. And so, while the diplomats in London and Berlin argued over treaties and naval tonnage, a silent, invisible invasion was taking place inside the body of the heir to the duchy. For the first year or two, the enemy was quiet. This is the cruel genius of syphilis. It gives its victim a false reprieve. After the initial sores heal, the patient can feel completely normal. He can ride horses, drink champagne, and convince himself that the doctor was a quack, or that he has been spared by divine intervention. Afy, young and desperate to believe in his own immortality, likely buried the memory of that infection deep in the back of his mind. He threw himself into the distractions of his new life, trying to outrun the shadow of the Prussian eagle that hung over his family. But the eagle was inescapable. The dominating force of Afy's existence in the late 1890s was not his father, the distant and drunken Duke, but his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. To understand the psychological disintegration of young Afy, you have to look at the man who set the standard for German masculinity. Wilhelm was a man built of insecurities, welded together by armor plating. Born with a withered left arm, a disability he hid with fanatical obsession, Wilhelm compensated by becoming the most hypermasculine, aggressive, and militaristic man in Europe. He shouted, he bullied, he wore a different uniform for every hour of the day. He demanded that everyone around him reflect this rigid, iron-hard image of Germanic strength. When Wilhelm looked at Afy, he saw everything he despised. Afy was slender. He was soft-spoken. He preferred the violin to the rifle. He had an English accent. In the eyes of the Kaiser and his Prussian generals, Afy was a weakling. And in the German Empire of the late 19th century, weakness was a sin worse than cruelty. The pressure on Afy to conform was relentless. He was dragged to military maneuvers in the mud of Potsdam. He was forced to sit on a horse for hours while the Kaiser reviewed the troops, barking criticisms at his cousin's posture, his salutes, his command of the language. Imagine the humiliation. You are 22 years old. You are the heir to a sovereign state, but you are treated like a slow-witted recruit by your own family. The Kaiser would make jokes at Afy's expense at dinner parties, loud, braying jokes that made the generals laugh and Afy flush with shame. His own father, Duke Alfred, would join in. The Duke was terrified of his nephew, the Kaiser. To curry favor with Berlin, Duke Alfred became a tyrant to his son. "Be more German," he would roar. "Be more of a soldier." The Duke wanted a son who could stand beside the Kaiser and look like a conqueror. Instead, he had a son who looked like a poet who had lost his way. Under this relentless psychological assault, Afy began to crack. The melancholy that had shadowed his childhood deepened into a profound, crushing depression. He felt trapped. He couldn't go back to England. He was the German heir. He couldn't be himself. Himself was unacceptable. So he began to disintegrate. He drank. The alcoholism that was killing his father became a crutch for the son. He was seen drunk at balls, his eyes glassy, his speech slurred. People whispered that the Coburg vice had claimed another victim. They shook their heads and said he was weak-willed. They were wrong. He wasn't just weak-willed. He was sick. By 1897, the dormancy was over. The bacteria had finished its incubation and was beginning its final assault. The symptoms of tertiary syphilis are the stuff of nightmares, and they are particularly terrifying because they mimic other things. At first, it just looks like eccentricity, a sudden burst of anger, a strange lapse in memory, a hand that won't stop shaking. Afy began to complain of lightning pains, a classic symptom of tabes dorsalis, where the disease attacks the spinal cord. It feels like being stabbed with a hot knife, sudden agonizing bolts of pain that shoot through the legs or the abdomen. He would be sitting at a state dinner, and suddenly his body would spasm with agony. He had to grit his teeth, sweating through his uniform, pretending nothing was wrong, because a German prince does not complain of pain. Then came the headaches. These weren't normal headaches. They were crushing, blinding migraines that felt like his skull was being put in a vice. They kept him awake for days, and with the pain came the mental changes. This was the onset of general paresis of the insane. The bacteria was eating away at the frontal lobes of his brain, the part that controls personality, judgment, and impulse control. The gentle, sensitive boy began to disappear. In his place was a stranger. Affy became paranoid. He started to believe that his servants were spying on him, that his food was being tampered with. He had mood swings that terrified his sisters. One moment he would be weeping uncontrollably, sobbing like a child. The next, he would fly into a rage, screaming at a footman for a minor infraction, his face purple, his eyes bulging. Then, just as quickly, he would collapse into apathy, staring at the wall for hours, unable to speak. The doctors were called in, and this is where the tragedy turns into a horror movie. Late 19th century medicine knew what syphilis was, but they couldn't cure it. They didn't have antibiotics. Penicillin was 30 years away. All they had were poisons. They treated Affy with mercury. They rubbed it into his skin. They injected it. They made him inhale the vapor. Mercury is a heavy metal toxin. The side effects of the cure mimic the disease itself. It causes tremors. It causes tooth loss. It causes excessive salivation. Affy would have had to constantly wipe drool from his mouth, a humiliation for a young man raised to be a prince. It causes erethism, a neurological disorder characterized by extreme shyness, anxiety, and sudden outbursts of anger. It is quite possible that the madness Affy displayed in his final years was as much a result of the mercury poisoning as the syphilis itself. He was being slowly poisoned to death by the men sworn to save him. The family watched this deterioration with a mixture of horror and denial. His mother, the Grand Duchess Marie, was a woman who believed that willpower could conquer anything. She refused to name the disease. To admit her son had the French pox was impossible. It was a filthy, lower-class affliction. No, she insisted, Affy was just nervous. It was the bad air in Coburg. It was the stress of his position. She coddled him, but she also suffocated him. She dragged him to spas, to seaside resorts, surrounding him with a phalanx of doctors who were paid to keep their mouths shut and their diagnoses vague. His father, the Duke, took a different approach. He was disgusted. He saw his son's trembling hands and erratic behavior not as symptoms of a disease, but as a lack of character. He bullied Affy. He shouted at him to pull himself together. He forced him to attend public functions when Affy could barely stand. There are reports of Affy at military reviews in 1898, pale as a sheet, sweating, holding onto his saddle to keep from falling off, while his father glared at him with pure hatred. The Duke felt betrayed. He had given up his life in the Royal Navy to secure this duchy for his son, and his son was turning into a wreck. And then, into this cauldron of sickness and resentment, came the final ingredient, the demand for a marriage. It was 1898. Affy was 24. The succession was precarious. If Affy died without a son, the duchy would pass to the Duke of Connaught, creating a diplomatic mess. The family needed a healthy male heir, and they needed one now. The dynastic machine began to turn. The matchmaking lists were drawn up. The perfect candidate was selected, Duchess Elsa of Württemberg. She was a twin, she was German, she was Protestant, she was royal. She was, in the eyes of Queen Victoria and the Grand Duchess Marie, the solution to everything. A good marriage would settle Affy down. It would stop the rumors. It would secure the future. They pressured him. The letters flew back and forth between London and Coburg. Queen Victoria wrote urging the match. His mother planned the engagement announcements. But Affy dug his heels in. He refused. He said no. Why? A cynical historian might say he knew he was sick. He knew he was infectious. To marry a young, innocent princess and infect her with syphilis, as so many royal husbands did, would be a monstrous act. Perhaps Affy, with his innate sensitivity, simply couldn't bring himself to do it. Perhaps he had enough conscience left to refuse to pass his curse on to a wife and a child who would be born with congenital syphilis. But there was another reason, one that whispered through the courts of Europe and terrified his parents even more than the disease. Afy was in love. The identity of the woman who captured the dying prince's heart has been scrubbed from the archives with ruthless efficiency. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha did not keep letters that embarrassed them, but the rumors were persistent, and they were specific. Some said she was an actress in Berlin, others said she was a commoner he met in Ireland. But the most dangerous rumor, the one that reportedly caused the Duke of Edinburgh to have an apoplectic fit of rage, was that she was Mabel Fitzgerald. The name matters less than what she represented. She was impossible. In the rigid, caste-obsessed world of the German aristocracy, she was a non-person. Even worse, the whisperers claimed she might be Jewish. In 1898 Germany, anti-Semitism was not a fringe sentiment. It was a fashionable prejudice of the upper classes. For the hereditary prince of a German duchy to marry a Jewish woman was not just a scandal, it was political suicide. It would have given the Kaiser cause to strip Afy of his rank. It would have made the family pariahs. But Afy, his mind loosening under the grip of the disease, didn't care about politics anymore. He was dying and he knew it. He wanted to grasp at one final straw of happiness. He wanted to marry the woman he loved. He told his parents he would renounce his rights. He told them he didn't want the duchy. He just wanted to be free. The reaction was nuclear. The Grand Duchess Marie was appalled. Queen Victoria was sternly disapproving. The Duke of Edinburgh threatened to have him declared insane and locked up. They told him the marriage was forbidden. They told him the woman would be ruined if he persisted. They used every lever of emotional and financial blackmail they had. They broke him. By the autumn of 1898, Afy had nothing left. His body was a vessel of pain. His mind was fracturing into paranoia and delusion. The love of his life had been ripped away. His father hated him. His cousin, the Kaiser, mocked him. He was the loneliest young man in Europe. His physical collapse became too obvious to hide. He started having seizures. He couldn't hold a fork without shaking. He would break into unprovoked weeping at the dinner table. The Duke and Duchess realized they couldn't have him in Coburg for the upcoming winter season. People were talking. The nervous condition excuse was wearing thin, so they sentenced him to exile. In November 1898, Afy was packed into a carriage and sent south. His destination was Meran, a resort town in the Tyrolean Alps, famous for its clean air and its sanitariums. It was a beautiful golden cage. He was installed in a villa surrounded by a retinue of doctors and equerries who were ostensibly there to care for him, but in reality were his jailers. Their orders were clear: keep him quiet, keep him out of sight, get him well enough to stand up at a wedding, or keep him hidden until he died. Imagine the isolation. He is hundreds of miles from home. He is cut off from his friends, from the woman he loves. He is subjected to daily regimens of cold baths, electric shock therapies, and more mercury. He sits on a terrace wrapped in blankets, looking at the snowy peaks of the Alps, while the bacteria eats the last remnants of his sanity. He receives letters from home detailing the preparations for the silver wedding anniversary, the guest lists, the menus, the music. He realizes he is not expected to be there. They are planning the party without him. They are happier without him. Something in Afy snapped. The docile, beaten dog finally bit back. In late January 1899, a new frantic energy took hold of him. This is a common phase of GPI, a sudden burst of manic, grandiose energy before the final collapse. He decided he wasn't going to stay in Moran. He was the hereditary prince, and he was going to attend his parents' anniversary. He was going to claim his place. He bullied his staff. He likely used the authority of his rank to override the doctors. "I am the prince," he would have shouted, his eyes blazing with that feverish, syphilitic light. "I order you to prepare the train." He arrived in Gotha in the first week of February. His parents were horrified. When he stepped off the train, he looked like a revenant. He was gaunt, his skin gray and pasty, his eyes sunk deep into his skull. He was trembling violently, but he was there. And because the Kaiser was coming, because the Duke of Connaught was coming, they couldn't send him back. They couldn't make a scene. They had to grit their teeth, put him in a uniform, and pray he didn't collapse. For the first few days of the festivities, Affi was a ghost at the feast. He moved through the reception rooms of Schloss Friedenstein like an automaton. He avoided eye contact. He flinched at loud noises. He drank heavily to steady his nerves, which only made his behavior more erratic. The guests whispered, "Look at young Affi," they murmured behind their fans. "He looks like death. What is wrong with him?" "It's the blood," some said, "bad blood." February 6th dawned cold and bright. It was the main day of the celebration. The morning was filled with a grand service in the castle chapel. Affi stood in his pew, swaying slightly, sweating in the cold air. He listened to the prayers for the long life and happiness of his parents. He listened to the sermons about the sanctity of the family and the divine favor resting on the house of Coburg. It must have sounded like a cruel joke. Divine favor? He was rotting. Sanctity? His father was hungover. His mother was bitter. Long life? He knew he wouldn't see 30. After the service, there was a luncheon. The wine flowed. The Kaiser made a bombastic speech praising the German spirit. Affi sat there, the noise of the cutlery and the voices amplifying in his head into a roar. The pain in his skull was likely blinding. The paranoia was whispering to him that they were all looking at him, all judging him, all waiting for him to fail. He couldn't take it anymore. He stood up. He mumbled an excuse. He stumbled out of the room. He didn't go to the garden. He didn't go to the library. He went straight to his private quarters. He closed the heavy oak door. He locked it. He was alone with the silence. For the first time in years, the shouting of the Kaiser, the nagging of his mother, the lectures of his father, it all stopped. He walked to his desk. He opened the drawer. He took out the revolver. It was a small thing, cold and heavy in his shaking hand. He didn't write a note. What was there to say? To whom would he write? To the father who despised him? To the mother who denied his reality? To the woman he was forbidden to love? He sat down. He lifted the gun. He pressed the barrel against his temple, or perhaps his forehead. He didn't want to be the hereditary prince anymore. He didn't want to be a pawn. He just wanted the noise to stop. He pulled the trigger. The shot was not the end. It was the beginning of the nightmare. The bullet smashed into his skull, tearing through bone and tissue. But Affi, poor, tragic, incompetent Affi, couldn't even die correctly. He slumped to the floor, blood pouring from the wound, consciousness flickering, but not extinguishing. Downstairs, the echo of the shot reached the ears of the family. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a dynasty collapsing. The servants ran. The door was forced open. And there, amidst the wreckage of his own life, lay the prince, not dead, but dying, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. The doctors were summoned, not to save him, the wound was fatal, but to manage the situation. They bound his head, they cleaned the blood, they likely sedated him heavily. And then the real work began. The Duke and Duchess stood over the body of their son. The shock must have been paralyzing. But they were royals, and for royals the first instinct is never grief, it is survival. They looked at each other. They looked at the Kaiser, who had been ushered into the room, his face a mask of thunderous anger at this disruption, this scandal. "He is not dead," someone said. "No," came the reply, "but he cannot be here, not like this." The decision was made instantly. The guests were told the prince had collapsed. A sudden turn, a hemorrhage. The word suicide was banned from the room, but they couldn't keep a dying man with a bullet in his head in a castle full of wedding guests. It was too risky. Someone might see, someone might talk. And so, in an act of cruelty that defies comprehension, they decided to move him. They ordered a carriage, or perhaps an ambulance wagon. They bundled the unconscious, bleeding prince onto a stretcher. They carried him down the back stairs, away from the prying eyes of the ambassadors and the dukes. They took him out into the freezing February afternoon. They were sending him away again, back to the cage, back to the silence. They were sending him back to Moran. He was dying. He had a bullet in his brain, and his parents put him on a train for a 3-day journey across the Alps. This was the final betrayal. They didn't just want him dead, they wanted him elsewhere. They wanted the corpse to be found in a sanitarium, not in the ancestral castle. They wanted to geographically separate the suicide from the celebration. For 3 days, the train chugged south through the snow. Affie lay in a private carriage, drifting in and out of a coma, attended by grim-faced doctors who knew they were chaperoning a corpse. His mother, to her credit, went with him. Perhaps guilt finally broke through the denial. Perhaps she couldn't bear to let him die alone on a train. On February 9, 1899, the train arrived in Meran. They moved him to the Villa Martin, and there, at 4:15 in the afternoon, surrounded by the alien beauty of the mountains, far from the home he had tried to return to, Prince Alfred breathed his last. The telegram was sent to Gotha. The Duke received it. He nodded. He turned to his staff. "The prince has died," he said, "of a tumor." The cover-up was live. The telegram that arrived in London on February 9, 1899, was a masterpiece of diplomatic fiction. It traveled over the wires from the snowy mountains of Tyrol, passed through the hands of clerks and secretaries, and finally landed on the desk of the Queen Empress at Osborne House. It contained the news that her grandson was dead, but it did not contain the truth. The official narrative, constructed in the terrifyingly quiet hours following the gunshot in Gotha, had now hardened into fact. The world was told that the hereditary prince had succumbed to chronic cerebral affection, a polite Victorian euphemism that allowed the public to imagine a tumor, or perhaps a stroke, or even a lingering consumption. It suggested a tragedy of biology, not a tragedy of the soul. It erased the gun. It erased the syphilis. It erased the scream of a young man who had found the burden of his existence too heavy to bear. In the days following the death, the machinery of two empires, the British and the German, synchronized perfectly to sell this lie. It was a massive operation of information control, executed in an age before the internet, but facing the newly voracious appetite of the penny press. The newspapers were hungry for details. Why had the prince died so young? Why had he left the silver wedding celebrations? Why was he in Moran? The royal family fed them the script, and the press, bound by the deferential codes of the 19th century, printed it verbatim. The Times published lengthy obituaries praising the prince's gentle nature and mourning the insidious illness that had cut him down. In Berlin, the Kaiser's censors ensured that no whisper of the revolver made it into print. To suggest that a Hohenzollern cousin, a German officer, had taken the coward's way out was treason. It would have undermined the military ethos of the Prussian state. Suicide was for poets and hysterics, not for princes of the blood. But while the public mourned a tragedy of fate, the family mourned a tragedy of shame. Queen Victoria, 80 years old and dressed in her eternal widow's weeds, took the news with the stoicism of a woman who had buried 3 children and a husband. But her private journals reveal the strain of the deception. She wrote of her poor, darling Afy, expressing shock and sorrow. She wrote about the grief of his parents, but she carefully, deliberately omitted the manner of his death. She knew. The encrypted telegrams from the British ambassador in Berlin had told her everything, but Victoria was the guardian of the monarchy's mystique. She knew that the crown relied on being seen as chosen by God. If the people knew that the Queen's own grandson had been so wretched that he blew his brains out during a family party, the magic would tarnish. So she locked the truth in her heart and in the sealed archives of Windsor and played her part in the great charade. Meanwhile, a grotesque logistical operation was taking place in Europe. The body of the prince had to be brought back. He had been shipped to Meran to die out of sight, and now his corpse had to be shipped back to Gotha to be buried with full military honors. The train ride north was a grim mirror image of the journey down. 3 days earlier, Afy had been a dying man, bleeding and comatose, rattling over the tracks. Now he was a sealed coffin. His mother, the Grand Duchess Marie, traveled with him. One can only imagine the atmosphere in that private carriage. The blinds were drawn. The silence was absolute. Marie sat with the body of the son she had smothered with ambition and then failed to save. She was a woman of iron will, a Romanov who believed that emotions were something to be conquered. But this broke her. She had fought the Princess of Wales for precedence. She had fought the British court for respect. She had fought to make her husband a sovereign duke. She had won all those battles only to lose the war in the most devastating way possible. The next in line was Queen Victoria's third son, Arthur, Duke of Connaught. Arthur was a career soldier in the British Army. He was English to his core. He had zero desire to uproot his life, learn German, and become a vassal of his nephew, the Kaiser. He looked at the miserable fate of his brother Alfred, trapped in a German castle, bullied by Berlin, dead of drink and grief, and said, "No?" He renounced his rights. His son, Prince Arthur of Connaught, a student at Eton, also renounced his rights. They wanted nothing to do with the cursed inheritance of Coburg. The royal game of musical chairs continued until the music stopped in front of the most tragic candidate possible, Charles Edward. Charles Edward was the son of Queen Victoria's youngest son, Leopold, Duke of Albany. Leopold was a hemophiliac who had died young. Charles Edward, known as Charlie to the family, was a student at Eton. He was 15 years old. He was a sweet, shy English boy who loved cricket and his mother. He barely spoke a word of German. But he was the only one left. The Kaiser demanded an heir. Queen Victoria, putting dynastic duty above the happiness of her grandchild, agreed. In 1899, while the crypt in Gotha was still fresh, the order was given. Charlie was pulled out of Eton. He was ripped away from his mother, the Duchess of Albany. He was put on a boat and shipped to Germany. It was a replay of Afy's tragedy, but with a different ending. Afy had been too old to mold, so he broke. Charlie was young enough to be brainwashed. He arrived in a country he didn't know, to rule a people whose language he couldn't speak. He was placed under the guardianship of the Kaiser. Wilhelm II looked at this terrified English boy and decided he would succeed where he had failed with Afy. He would turn Charlie into the perfect Prussian. He sent him to the harshest military academy in Lichterfelde. He isolated him from his English relatives. He drilled the doctrine of German nationalism, militarism, and obedience into him. And it worked. The sweet English boy disappeared. In his place rose Karl Eduard, a stiff-monocled German duke who worshipped the Kaiser. 15 years later, when the guns of August 1914 signaled the start of World War I, this boy, born a British prince, a grandson of Victoria, would put on a German general's uniform and march to war against the land of his birth. He would be branded a traitor by the British, stripped of his English titles, and left embittered and radicalized. In the 1930s, that bitterness would lead him into the arms of the Nazis. Karl Eduard would become a chaotic, fervent supporter of Hitler, the Brown Duke, ending his life as a disgraced war criminal. That dark path from the trenches of WWI to the podiums of the Third Reich began because a bullet was fired in a bedroom in Gotha in 1899. If Affy had lived, if he hadn't been crushed by the expectations of his caste, Charlie would have remained a minor British prince, playing cricket in Surrey. The suicide of one prince didn't just end a life, it warped the future of the entire continent. But in 1900, none of this was known. The cover-up was holding. The newspapers moved on to other scandals. The Boer War was heating up, distracting the British public. The Kaiser was building his navy, distracting the German public. The grave in Gotha was quiet. Yet, silence is not the same as oblivion. The truth of Affy's death survived in the only place the censors couldn't reach, the private grief of his sisters. Marie, the eldest sister, was particularly haunted. She had married the Crown Prince of Romania and moved to Bucharest, escaping the suffocating atmosphere of Coburg. But she carried the memory of her brother with her. She watched from afar as the lie cemented itself into history. In her later years, after she became the celebrated Queen Marie of Romania, she wrote her memoirs. They are beautiful, flowery, and romantic books. But when she comes to the chapter of 1899, her prose changes. It becomes jagged. She circles the truth like a moth around a flame, desperate to touch it, but afraid of the burn. She writes of the shadow that fell over the family. She writes of the unspoken tragedy. She describes Affy's delicate nature being crushed by the iron machinery of their existence. She never writes the word suicide. She never writes syphilis. But she leaves breadcrumbs. She mentions his terrible sudden despair. She mentions the sound of a fall in the next room. She constructs a narrative that, to anyone who knew the code of the royal courts, screamed the truth. She was preserving his memory in the only way she could, by hinting that he was a victim, not a villain. She wanted the world to know that he hadn't just died. He had been destroyed. The conspiracy of silence also relied on the sheer medical ignorance of the public. The tumor story worked because people didn't know what a brain tumor really looked like, or they confused it with the vague symptoms of brain fever. But inside the medical community, the doctors knew. The specialists in Berlin and Vienna who had treated the royal houses gossiped. They knew the symptoms of GPI. They knew what nervous exhaustion in a young libertine prince meant. The medical files of the House of Hesse, the House of Hohenzollern, and the House of Saxe-Coburg are filled with these euphemisms. Rheumatism often meant gonorrhea. Gout could hide a multitude of alcoholic sins. Nervous exhaustion was almost always code for a mental breakdown or the ravages of syphilis. Affy's death was the ultimate triumph of this coded language. It was a masterpiece of Victorian hypocrisy. The era that prized outward respectability above all else had successfully sanitized its most glaring failure. They had taken a bloody, messy, heartbreaking suicide and turned it into a polite, sad obituary. But the cost of the lie was the erasure of Affy's humanity. By denying his suicide, they denied his pain. By hiding his syphilis, they denied his struggle. They turned him into a non-entity, a footnote in the family tree who died young. He became a blank space in the history books, a portrait in a hallway that nobody asked about. It wasn't until the late 20th century, when the archives were finally open and historians began to cross-reference the letters of Queen Victoria with the reports of the ambassadors, that the picture re-emerged. The encrypted telegrams were decoded, the whispers were substantiated, the blank space began to fill with blood and tears. We now know that Afy was the canary in the coal mine. His death was a warning that the royal system of Europe, with its intermarriage, its stifling protocol, and its detachment from reality, was becoming toxic to its own children. He was the first of the young generation to break, but he wouldn't be the last. The century of lies was about to give way to a century of violence. And as the Victorian era faded and the modern world dawned, the secrets of the royal houses would be exposed, not by historians, but by revolutions, wars, and the firing squads that were waiting in the wings of the 20th century. By the time World War I erupted in 1914, the tragedy of young Afy seemed like ancient history, but in reality the war was the macrocosmic version of his suicide. Europe, led by his cousins, King George V in Britain, Tsar Nicholas II in Russia, and Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany, was about to commit a collective act of self-destruction. The war was the ultimate triumph of the Prussian values that had killed Afy. It was the victory of the uniform over the individual, of duty over humanity, of the machine over the soul. The delicate artistic world that Afy had loved, the world of Vienna cafes, French boulevards, and music, was ground into the mud of the Somme and Verdun. And in a cruel twist of irony, the war destroyed the very thing Afy had died to secure, the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. When Germany lost the war in 1918, the monarchies fell like dominoes. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. In Coburg, the replacement heir, Charles Edward, the English boy brainwashed into a German duke, was forced to abdicate. The soldiers of the Workers' and Soldiers' Council marched into the courtyard of Schloss Friedenstein, the very place where Afy had shot himself. The red flag of revolution was hoisted over the castle. The duchy was dissolved. The titles were abolished. The glittering world of the silver wedding anniversary, with its beeswax candles and champagne, was swept away into the dustbin of history. If Afy had lived, he would have been 44 years old in 1918. He would have been the reigning duke. He would have been forced to lead his small state into a war against his mother's family in Russia and his father's family in Britain. He would have had to send young men to die in the trenches. Perhaps in his own dark, twisted way, Afy saw the future. Perhaps his suicide was not just an act of despair, but an act of refusal. He refused to be a cog in the machine. He refused to be the duke who marched his people into hell. He checked out of the game before the stakes became apocalyptic. Today, Schloss Friedenstein still stands in Gotha. It is a museum now. You can walk through the grand halls where the silver wedding was celebrated. You can see the portraits of the family. Duke Alfred, with his bushy beard, Duchess Marie with her diamonds, and young Afy forever frozen in his youth, looking out at the viewer with those large, sad eyes. Tourists walk past his portrait and usually don't stop. The guidebooks might mention he died young. They rarely mention the gun. They rarely mention the syphilis. The cover-up was so successful that even today, Afy is a footnote. But his story is not just a royal curiosity. It is a profound human tragedy that speaks to the destructive power of shame. We live in an age that likes to believe we have moved past this. We talk about mental health. We have treatments for syphilis. We don't force princes to rule duchies they hate. But the core themes of Afy's life, the pressure to live up to parental expectations, the fear of being exposed, as weak or flawed, the terrifying isolation of depression, are timeless. Affy was a man who had everything the world says we should want: money, power, status, beauty. And yet he was in hell. He was surrounded by people, yet completely alone. He was the heir to a kingdom, yet he had no control over his own life. His suicide was a scream that pierced the velvet silence of the Victorian age. It was a crack in the facade of perfection that the monarchy depended on. For a brief, terrifying moment, the curtain was pulled back, and the world saw that the people inside the palace were not gods. They were just frightened, broken human beings bleeding on the floor while the band played on. As we leave the story of Prince Alfred, let us not remember him as the failure his father thought he was. Let us remember him as the boy who loved music, the boy who loved the sun in Malta, the young man who fell in love with a woman he couldn't have and who was too gentle for a world that demanded iron. He was the prince who broke, and in breaking he revealed the brokenness of the world that made him. February 6th, 1999. Exactly 100 years after the shot. The room where it happened is quiet. The bloodstains were scrubbed away a century ago. The furniture has been moved, the wallpaper changed. There is no plaque on the wall, no memorial candle burns. To the visitors walking through the museum, it is just another room in another castle. They do not know that a young man died here because he couldn't bear to live a lie. But if you listen closely to the silence of history, you can almost hear it. Not the gunshot, that was just the end. You can hear the scratch of a pen on a letter that was never sent. You can hear the rattle of a pill bottle on a bedside table. You can hear the weeping of a young man who realized that his golden cage was locked, and the key had been thrown away by the people who claimed to love him. Prince Alfred of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The tumor that killed him was not in his brain. It was in the crown he was born to wear. And somewhere in the dusty archives of Europe, perhaps there is still a letter, tucked into a forgotten diary, written in a shaky hand, that tells the true name of the woman he loved. A final testament to the life that was stolen and the truth that was